here to introduce Bill Causey, who is an author, but also my neighbor. Actually, he and his wife are very gracious neighbors that I have, and I've always enjoyed running into them in the hallway. And I think it must have been, I want to say maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I ran into you and you announced, I'm writing a book. I'm doing research for a book. I was like, wow, that's amazing. I always thought, very highly of people who have the concentration, the discipline to write a book. And so every once in a while, I would follow up with Bill and say, "Oh, how's your book going?" And finally, it's been published, and I was like, "Great." And then earlier this year, I realized, you know what? I need to invite Bill to present to the Rotary Club. So that's why we have Bill. In full disclosure, I've not read the book yet, but I love what I've seen about it, and I do want to read the book because it's about big ideas, and also it's about science. And I grew up in a household where my father was a physicist, my mother was a mathematician, so those things really appeal to me. So without further ado, I want to introduce Bill Causey.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to all of you. This organization runs with the precision of NASA. I'm amazed. I'm also very pleased to see my old friend Cy Ansary here. In many ways, Cy was my first boss. More than 50 years ago, he was the board president for the American University Board of Trustees. I was a new board member. I had just graduated from American University. They had a policy at that time to put the previous student body president on the board. That was me. And I had the honor of serving with Cy. Cy told me how to behave as a board member. He told me when to speak up, and more importantly, he told me when to be quiet. But it's great to see you, Cy. I'm here to tell you about my book, John Houbolt, the Unsung Hero of the Apollo moon landings. John Houbolt was the person who convinced NASA how to send Apollo astronauts to the moon. And I want to tell you that story because my book is the story of how he did that. John was born in April of 1919 in Altoona, Iowa. He was one of 3 children. He lived on a farm. And John was a very precocious child. During the day, he would do his farming chores, but at night he would read math and physics and think about flying and engineering. And he went on to get his undergraduate degree and his master's degree in engineering from the University of Illinois. And then in 1942, he joined the Langley Research Center, which was in Hampton, Virginia, and he joined there and became an aeronautical engineer. And he met his wife, Mary, at Langley. She was one of the hidden figures. She was a human computer that worked there at Langley. My book tells a very, I think, interesting story about how John maneuvered to make sure Mary paid attention to him. And they got married and had 3 children. And Mary was a delightful person. She passed away about a year ago. She was 94 years old. But our story really begins in October of 1957 when the Soviet Union orbited the first artificial satellite around the Earth. And of course, that spooked America. Now we no longer had 2 oceans to protect us. Soviet missiles could come to the United States, and that changed everything. And during the year after that happened, President Eisenhower, who got a lot of pressure to create a space agency to deal with all this, worked with then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, and they passed the legislation that became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And that was in October of 1958. 1 week after NASA opened its doors, its first administrator, Keith Glennon, who had been appointed by President Eisenhower, created the program called Project Mercury. And it was designed to be to send America's first astronaut into space. And it really was a visionary program, because when they created Project Mercury, there were no astronauts. But they figured, well, let's get the program started, let's get it funded, and then we'll go get us some astronauts. And at the same time, Keith Glennon worked very closely with a rocket scientist in the truest sense of the word named Wernher von Braun, who came here after World War II. He surrendered to the Americans in Germany, brought here by the Army, and he was down in Huntsville, Alabama, and he was developing two very, very powerful rockets, basically for the military. One was called Nova, and one was called Saturn. We'll come back to that in a minute. Even though Project Mercury had been started and funded by Congress, NASA was very quietly planning to send astronauts to the moon. They didn't talk about it publicly. It was all secretly done at NASA headquarters. Eisenhower wasn't really supporting a trip to the moon. We certainly knew Congress wasn't going to fund a trip to the moon. They barely could come up with the money to fund Project Mercury. But NASA worked very hard at trying to figure this out, and a young engineer by the name of George Low took the lead, and he started coming up with some plans to send astronauts to the moon. This was in 1960. And George Low came up with an idea to send a long, tall, about a 60-foot tall rocket, landed on the moon with 3 astronauts, take off from the moon in that long rocket, and it became known around NASA as the Big Cigar, and come home. And that was what was going to be our trip to the moon as we first came up with these plans. And John Houbolt down in Langley, Virginia, said, I don't think that idea is going to work. It's too heavy, it's too dangerous, it's too expensive. And I think I can come up with a better idea. So John sat together with some of his colleagues, and they came up with an idea that they called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, or LOR. And his idea was to send not one big, tall rocket, heavy rocket to the moon, but send 2 much smaller spacecrafts to the moon, have the mother craft take the 3 astronauts to the moon with the smaller lander. Then when they get to the moon, have 2 of the astronauts get into the lander, have the lander go down and land on the moon, come back up. It was much lighter, much smaller. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous with the mothership, and then all 3 of them come home, and the lander would just crash back on the moon. Well, when John came up with this idea, everybody said, John, that's a crazy idea. It's not going to work. I mean, we can barely figure out how to send 1 spacecraft to the moon, not 2. And Rendezvous, we've never even done Rendezvous. We've never even sent humans into space yet. This is just a crazy idea. Well, John didn't think so. He thought it was the way to go. So he started going around talking at small groups within NASA and groups like this and around to the public. And everybody was very disdainful of John's idea. They said it's just a silly, crazy idea. It's a Buck Rogers idea, and it's just not going to work. Well, John was very persistent. He kept at it. He was at one meeting in NASA headquarters here in Washington, and a young engineer named Max Faget, and Max will pop up in a minute in our story, stood up and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. Your numbers are all off." But John was very offended by that, because when John was a high school student, he took on a project to measure how much the roof of his high school weighed. And he was 0.3 pounds off. So John was very offended when he was told his numbers didn't work. But John got a lot of resistance to the idea of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. NASA was going to stay with the Big Cigar. And then in September of 1960, things started to change. Keith Glennon hired a young engineer by the name of Robert Siemens to be the number 3 administrator at NASA. Siemens worked for the Rand Corporation in Boston, and his job in this secret military project was to shoot down Russian satellites. He knew all about Rendezvous, and he knew that Rendezvous was going to work, and he knew it was the only way we were going to wind up working in space. And then 2 months later, John Kennedy was elected president. And many of you don't realize this probably, but Kennedy was not a big space fan when he was elected president. He was in favor of a military program for space, but he thought sending humans into space was a waste of time and a waste of money. And he wanted nothing to do with it. So he gets elected president. One of the first things he has to do is hire a new administrator for NASA. Kennedy had no interest in doing that. So who does he turn to? He turned to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. He said, Lyndon, find me an administrator for NASA. Lyndon interviewed 19 people. All 19 people turned him down. They all knew that Kennedy was not interested in space. And Johnson finally called an old friend of his named James Webb and said, I need you here in Washington on Monday morning. I want to talk to you. And Webb flies to Washington. And Johnson says, I want you to be the leader of NASA. And Webb says, oh gosh, Mr. Vice President, I don't think I can do that. Let me go quickly call my wife and talk to her about it. And he said, oh, Johnson said, okay, go ahead. Webb goes out into the hallway, calls his wife back in Oklahoma. And his wife said, honey, I just heard on TV, you're going to be the next administrator of NASA. So that's how Lyndon Johnson would do things. So fortunately, James Webb became the administrator of NASA. But three things changed for Kennedy within the first couple months of his administration. First of all, on April 12th, 1961, the Soviet Union launched the first human into space. That was another shocker. It was like almost as shocking as Sputnik. 1 week later, the Bay of Pigs happened, and that was a failure. So Kennedy is walking around the White House, and he's talking with his one of his top advisors, Ted Sorensen, and he says, you know, Ted, we've got to do something. What can we do to beat the Russians in space? We've got to get our prestige back. And Sorensen said, give it to Lyndon. Let him figure it out. And Kennedy sent a memo to Johnson and said, figure out what we can do. And within about 10 days, Johnson came back with the idea of, let's send astronauts to the moon. Well, at this point, we had never even launched an astronaut yet. And Kennedy said, you know what? Maybe that is just what we need to do. Kennedy saw it, of course, as an effort to win back the Cold War, which we were losing at that moment. And then the third thing happened that really convinced Kennedy to do this. And that's when on May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard was the first American to go into space. I suspect some of you, I can tell from some of you in this group probably remember when Alan Shepard went into space. I remember watching my black and white TV in my elementary school gymnasium. And Kennedy said this, he was amazed at the popular response to Shepard's flight. And Kennedy said, Lyndon, you're absolutely right. Let's do this. So on May 25th, 1961, Kennedy goes before Congress and he announces the Apollo program. You know, we will send astronauts to the moon before the end of the decade and bring them back. And Project Apollo was started. The only problem is all the people at NASA sat down and said, oh my gosh, we have no idea how to do this. And he wants us to do it by the end of the decade, which is what, 8-9 years later. So they had to get to work. And Bob Siemens, who had been hired by Keith Glennon, put together two committees immediately. Siemens was an exceptional manager, and he created two committees that worked separately. One was a large committee of about 30 people, mid-level engineers to kind of figure out the technology of how to get to the moon. And the other was a much smaller committee of 10 members who were managers and money people. And he had them both work separately. And his charge to them was, come back and tell me how we should go to the moon. Well, both of them submitted their report in the summer of 1961. And both of them said, well, I think we can do this. We'll send the big cigar, and lunar orbit rendezvous wasn't even considered. Well, Siemens was quite upset about that. Siemens knew rendezvous. He had talked to John Houbolt. He thought Houbolt's idea made a lot of sense. And Siemens then did a do-over. He created a third committee. And on this committee, it was chaired by a guy named Donald Heaton. this committee, Siemens said, Don, I want you to consider Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And to make sure that the committee would do that, Siemens put John Houbolt on the committee. So the committee met through the late summer and early fall of 1961, and they issued their report, and there was no mention of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Siemens was furious. John Houbolt was even more furious. Houbolt goes to Heaton and he says, Donald, you were supposed to consider Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. You didn't even mention it in your report. And Heaton says, John, if you feel that strongly about it, go write your own minority report. And that's exactly what Houbolt did. He went back to Langley Research Center. He sat down with some of his colleagues, and for 2 weeks, over pizza and beer and nothing else, they wrote a 2-volume minority report that laid out the reason why LOR was the way to go to the moon. And to make sure that Siemens understood that Houbolt was doing his part, he sent a copy of the report to Siemens with a cover letter, very famous document in the Apollo history. And the cover letter begins, Dear Dr. Siemens, I know I'm a voice in the wilderness, but here is my report on why we should use LOR to go to the moon. So at the end of the year, there was a problem down in Huntsville. Remember, I told you we would come back to Wernher von Braun? He was developing the big Nova rocket and the big Saturn rocket. Well, von Braun could not figure out how to build the large Nova rocket. It was just simply beyond our technology at the time. The rocket that we're going to send up with Elon Musk in a short bit, Starflight, that was even bigger than Nova. And they had to cancel the Nova program. So they fell back to Saturn. Saturn was a big rocket, as we know, not as big as Nova. But when they were testing the engines, the original Saturn rocket had 4 engines at the bottom. And when they were testing the engines, they discovered that there was an accumulation of very dangerous gases in the center of the 4 engines, and it might explode on ignition. So von Braun said, hey, that's a simple solution. We'll just put a 5th engine there. And that's what they did. That's how Saturn developed 5 engines. And now it was powerful enough to send both the command module and the lunar lander to the moon with 1 launch. So everything was starting to come together for John Houbolt. And then the head of the Apollo program at the time, an engineer by the name of Brainerd Holmes, decided to bring in a new engineer to basically run the Apollo program. And he brought in a young guy named Joe Shea. Joe Shea was a very interesting guy. He would, if you came in the morning and he was wearing red socks and you were supposed to go to a meeting that Joe Shea was going to have, you had to show up because the red socks meant you had to come to the meeting. So he was a very unusual person, but he was a brilliant engineer. And on his very first day at NASA, January 2nd, 1962, Brainerd Holmes comes into Joe Shea's office at NASA headquarters. Joe Shea's got a metal desk and a chair. That's all he has in this office. And Brainerd Holmes throws down on his desk a copy of Houbolt's 2-volume report. And he says, Joe, welcome to NASA. Here, read this. Your job is to figure out how we're going to go to the moon. So how would you like to have that on your opening day of work? So Shea reads the report. He talks with George Lowe, who developed the big cigar, and they both agreed with Siemens that LOR made a lot of sense, but they had to convince everybody else. So Joe Shea goes around to all of the NASA centers around the country, Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Manned Spacecraft Center and Langley and Cleveland, and he starts to get everybody to fall in line. And soon, everybody in the NASA program was going to now support LOR except Wernher von Braun. What Wernher von Braun said was, well, look, I've got my Saturn rocket now. We can still put the big cigar on the moon. What we'll do is we'll launch several Saturn rockets, do what I'll call Earth orbit rendezvous. We'll put the big cigar together in Earth orbit and then send it to the moon. Well, of course, it still had the same problem. You were landing a big, large vehicle on the moon that was too dangerous and too heavy. So Joe Shea was very worried because von Braun carried a lot of weight within NASA. And in June, the President's Science Advisory Committee was going to have its meeting. The committee would rotate its meeting around the country every month. And in June, it was going to have the meeting at Huntsville. And Joe Shea said to Von Braun, do me a favor, tack on a third day to the meeting. I want to talk with your group. NASA announced that Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was the way to go, but they only had one other person to convince. They had to convince President Kennedy. Because Kennedy's science advisor was saying to him, don't agree to Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, it's not going to work. And Kennedy said, well, you know what, let's figure this out. I'm going to go down and have a bunch of meetings at the Cape, at Houston, and in Huntsville, and we'll decide down there what we're going to do. So Kennedy takes with him, and this was an incredibly important visit by the president, he took the vice president, the secretary of defense, the head of NASA. I mean, can you imagine the pilot of that plane flying them all down to the south? And they toured around for a little bit, and Kennedy became convinced that Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was the way to go. And Kennedy gave a speech at Rice University on the third day of his trip down there on September 12, 1962, explaining why the Apollo program was important. And I urge all of you to go on YouTube and watch that speech. I think Kennedy gave three great speeches when he was president. The inaugural address, his speech at American University for the Test Ban Treaty, and the speech at Rice University. And it's only 20 minutes. It's, you know, it won't take you long, probably less than the time I'm going to speak here. And it was a great speech. You know, Kennedy had an enormous wit, and it was 102 degrees that day. He spoke outside at Rice University. And there's a line in his speech where he talks about the command module coming back to the Earth and coming through the atmosphere, and it was going to be 5,000 degrees coming through the atmosphere. And Kennedy paused and he said, about as hot as it is here today. So it really is a great speech, and I urge you to go take a look at it. But unfortunately, history does not have a piece of paper that has John Kennedy's signature on it approving Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. By the time Kennedy gave the Rice speech, it was just assumed that LOR was going to be the way to go to the moon. Kennedy never signed a document formally approving the LOR program. But flash forward 7 years, it worked. We landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. That was the method they used. We did it 5 times in the next 2 years by using Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And now that we are getting ready to go back to the moon in about 2 years, we're going to use Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. So thank you, John Houbolt, for your fine work. And it will be something that we'll be still talking about for years to come. I want to thank you all very much. You've all been very patient, and I appreciate it. And if we have any time for questions, I'd be happy to take any questions.
How close were his numbers for the actual project? Did you revisit that issue?
For the project of the roof and the building?
No. For
the lander.
The land orbit.
The landing.
Your numbers don't work.
Oh, he had it just right.
He had it just right.
Yeah, Max Faget later called John Houbolt and said, I can't believe that the numbers you predicted for the lunar lander are about exactly what I figured out.
That's impressive. I was just telling my friend here that I was a freshman at the University of Texas that September when that speech, and I became a Kennedy fan by reading a shorter version of that speech.
It's a great speech. It really is a great speech. Any other questions?
Just one, and this is my spotty memory. Where does John Glenn fit into this? I thought John Glenn's orbit around the Earth was response to the Soviets.
Well, John Glenn was one of the original 7 astronauts. He was selected in 1959. He was one of the astronauts that basically worked on the Project Mercury program. Mercury was our first manned space program, and Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. But Apollo was a separate program from Mercury. Even though Mercury was important because it would send astronauts into space and we would learn how they would survive in space, Apollo was a completely different program. And Glenn really never got involved in the Apollo program directly.
On behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. and its Trees for the Capital program, I wanted to present you with this certificate signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor in our nation's capital.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.